Yes, so I was asked by Father Raphael to speak about the ancient history of the Orthodox West, and I decided on the period of AD 64 to 800, which hopefully the dates will make sense as we begin and we finish. Now, the pre-Christian West is identity and unity for the part of the Roman Empire. Over several hundred years, the Romans had not only built the largest empire the world had ever seen, but managed to maintain that empire in a relative state of stability and peace, the Pax Romana, as it was called. Romans saw the greatness of their empire as being based upon their traditional values of discipline and civic virtue, and also upon the favour of Rome's traditional gods, the emperor himself being regarded as one of these, as a god on earth. Rome truly seemed to be the eternal city. Within only a few years after Christ's death and resurrection, Christianity made its presence felt at the heart of the empire. According to church tradition, both apostles Saints Peter and Paul visited Rome and helped establish the church there. St. Peter appointed St. Linus as the first bishop of Rome, and around the year AD 64, both apostles were martyrdom in Rome during the persecution of the Emperor Nero. This illustration shows an early depiction of Saints Peter and Paul from Rome. Amongst the early Christians, the church in Rome would soon gain a reputation of being the most orthodox of all the local churches. In the later 2nd century, St. Irenaeus of Lyon advised that if one is in doubt about the true faith, one should simply follow the example set by Rome. Roman Catholic apologists would argue that this is an argument, as would use this as an argument in favour of the later doctrine of papal infallibility, a doctrine not accepted by orthodoxy. However, St. Irenaeus is not claiming infallibility for any individual, but simply stating that the Church at Rome was so reliably orthodox that it could be trusted to have the right opinion in most matters. It is a testimony to the high respect with which the Roman Church is held by Christians at this time. The world of the Eastern Mediterranean had various important cultural and political centres, which also became important centres of Christianity, namely Alexandria and Antioch, and later the city of Constantinople. In contrast, the West had only had one centre above all others, the city of Rome. The other more local churches of the West then looked to Rome primarily as their source of guidance. The liturgy practiced in this church of Rome became the basis of the liturgies used in other parts of the West. In keeping with the very conservative character of the Roman Church, the Roman liturgy long retained a primitive simplicity. Churches in other parts of the West would embellish the liturgy with various devotions, ceremonial, and hymnography. Eventually, some of these embellishments would be accepted in Rome itself. Nevertheless, the West retained for several centuries a diversity of liturgical traditions, such as the distinctive Mozarabic rite of Spain, the Gallic rite of Gaul, and the Milanese rite of Milan. The liturgical diversity was also a feature of the West, in the East, during the same period, whether because of how it became the practice to conform the liturgy to that practiced in Constantinople. The Church of Rome derived its position as the primary church of Christendom from the fact that it was derived its foundation from the leading apostles, Saints Peter and Paul. As the centuries progressed, the idea grew that the Pope of Rome, the Bishop of Rome, was the direct heir of Saint Peter. Pope Leo the Great in the mid-5th century was a particular opponent of this concept. It must be mentioned, though, that when the early fathers, even fathers of the West, interpreted the words of Christ to St. Peter, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my church," from Matthew 16, verse 18, they tended to see the rock that Christ promised to build the church on, not as Peter himself, but rather Peter's confession of faith. They're also aware of the gift of binding and loosing granted to St. Peter would later be given to the other apostles after the resurrection. Therefore, while St. Peter held a primacy of honour among the apostles, there nonetheless remained an equality among them as well. Because of the primacy of honour of the Church of Rome, Rome had the role of being able to intervene as a third party in disputes going on in other parts of the Church. An early example of this was a letter of St. Clement of Rome, which he wrote to the Church in Corinth towards the end of the 1st century. The Corinthian Church had rebelled against its clergy. In response, St. Clement, who had succeeded, well, he was the third bishop of Rome after St. Linus, sent a letter to the Corinthians, bidding them to end their rebellion and to be obedient to their leaders. This ancient letter was included in some early versions of the New Testament. Later it became a practice that if there was a dispute between two bishops that could not be resolved, the bishops could appeal to the Bishop of Rome for a judgment. This rule of the Church of Rome would be canonically confirmed at the Council of Sardica in 344. The Latin language was the official language of the Roman Empire. The earliest Roman Christians, however, wrote mostly in Greek, including St. Clement of Rome, St. Irenaeus of Lyon, and St. Justin the philosopher of Rome. Many of these earliest Christians were in fact immigrants from the East, who were settled in the West and continued to use Greek as their common language. The first Western Christian to write significantly in Latin was the theologian Tertullian, who lived in Rome and North Africa during the 2nd and 3rd centuries. While his writings were not highly sophisticated, they did coin the basic terminology for writing theology in Latin, whereas Greek theological terminology underwent some development due to the controversies that shaped the East, and due to the subtlety of the language. In the West, the terms Tertullian developed would remain fixed in Latin theology, and are the basis of many of the theological terms we use today in English as well. Latin would soon be adopted as the common language of the Christians of the West, and it will be retained by the Western Church as the language of its liturgy and learning long after the Roman Empire had fallen. In the year 312, the Emperor Constantine the Great established himself as Emperor of the West. One of his first acts was to issue the Edict of Milan, offering toleration to Christianity, faith to which he had recently been converted. It was the Emperor Constantine who built the original St. Peter's Basilica in Rome over the tomb of the Apostle Peter. This building was demolished in the 16th century to make way for the present basilica. He would also eventually extend the power of his power to the whole Roman Empire and establish a new capital in Constantinople. Later success of the Emperor Theodosius the Great would make Christianity the official religion of the empire in the year 380. Some conservative pagans among the Romans' elite resented these new cultural changes. Other members of Rome's elite became enthusiastic supporters of the church and became great leaders of the church in the West. One of these was St. Ambrose of Milan, a Christian member of an elite family who served as a judge. Despite not being yet baptized, by popular demand, he was the people of Milan. St. Ambrose was chosen to be bishop of the city. Within a matter of days, he was baptized, ordained deacon, and then priest, and finally consecrated as a bishop. St. Ambrose is remembered as an outstanding pastor and as one who introduced the practice of hymn singing into the Western Church, a tradition begun some decades before in the East, most notably by St. Ephrem the Syrian. St. Ambrose also defended the Orthodox faith against the Arian heresy, which denied the divinity of Christ. When Arian-minded emperors attempted to take control of Milan's cathedral, St. Ambrose and his congregation staged a lock-in protest, refusing to give up their church. Past the time inside the church, he taught his fellow protesters how to sing antiphonically, with two choirs singing in response to one another, a style again that had recently emerged in the East. According to tradition, when Arianism was finally defeated, St. Ambrose composed the Latin hymn titled Te Deum Laudamus, used very commonly in the Western liturgical tradition. St. Ambrose was not afraid to speak out also against the wrongdoings of Orthodox emperors. After Emperor Theodosius had massacred civilians in the city of Thessaloniki, St. Ambrose excommunicated him and forbade him from entering the Cathedral of Milan until he repented of his wicked acts. A contemporary of St. Ambrose was St. Jerome. Enthused by accounts of the lives of St. Anthony the Great and the Desert Fathers, St. Jerome left Rome to live briefly as a hermit in Palestine before establishing a Latin-speaking monastic community in Bethlehem. St. Jerome was a brilliant scholar, unusually for the period, fluent in Latin as well as in Latin, fluent in Hebrew as well as in Latin and Greek. He produced what would become the standard version of Holy Scriptures in Latin, what's called the Vulgate. A younger contemporary of Saints Ambrose and Jerome was Saint Augustine of Hippo. Saint Augustine was born to moderately wealthy Roman family in what is now Tunisia in North Africa. While still a young man, he was inspired to discover the truth through philosophy. His mother, Saint Monica, was a Christian, but Augustine soon gave up following his mother's faith, believing it was too simple. Instead, he joined the Manichaean cult, a form of Gnosticism. After some years, he found the severe shortcomings of this group's teachings, and by now he was living in Milan together with his widowed mother. Saint Monica had become very devoted to Saint Ambrose and was one of those who locked herself in the church together with him during his protest. Saint Augustine was now reading the works of Neoplatonist philosophers, followers of Plato, who with a particularly mystical interpretation of the teachings of Plato. And it was then announced to him that one of these Platonist philosophers had converted to Christianity. Augustine began looking at Christianity more seriously and listened to St. Ambrose's sermons. For the first time, he was able to see the true depth of Christianity and wisdom of the faith, and was baptized by St. Ambrose. St. Augustine later returned to North Africa, where he became a priest and later a bishop of the city of Hippo. He wrote extensively, and one of his best known works, his Confessions, which tells the story of his past life up to the time of his conversion. St. Augustine would in time become one of the most widely read church fathers in the Western Church. Whether particularly in more recent times, Augustine's teachings have been regarded as controversial among modern day Orthodox. St. Augustine was a very logical thinker. And when writing, often follow the logic of his principles to draw conclusions which contained some erroneous exaggerations. One of the main theological controversies that St. Augustine was involved in was raised by the British monk named Pelagius. Pelagius taught that it was possible for human beings to attain perfection in this life and salvation by their own strength alone without the need of the assistance of divine grace. St. Augustine rightly rejected this heresy. However, in arguing against it, St. Augustine's logic led him to the point of seeming to teach that salvation depended entirely on grace alone, to the point that salvation depended not on anything we could do to be saved ourselves, but on God choosing to save us, or rather to choosing to save certain people to the exclusion of others. It must be said, of course, that St. Augustine did not always fully accept his own logic in these matters. When some monks wrote to him asking if he regarded their asceticism as worthless, as a way to work out their salvation, he replied with a defense of human free will. Despite this, later non-Orthodox Western teachers, such as the Protestant theologian and teacher John Calvin, would revive Augustine's teachings on grace and carry them to their logical conclusion. In the year 410, the Christian world be shaken by the news of the fall of the city of Rome to the barbarians and its sacking by them. There was still a number of Roman pagans proudly clinging to the remains of Rome's illustrious pagan past, and these people blamed the fall of Rome on the fact that the traditional worship of that old pagan gods had been abandoned. This accusation inspired this accusation against Christianity inspired St. Augustine to spend the next 14 years writing a monumental book against the pagans entitled The City of God. In this book, St. Augustine attacked pagan beliefs and practices before going on to tell his own Christian version of the history of the world. According to this and his interpretation, human history can be divided into two strains, or two cities: the city of God, that is the part of humanity that tried to be faithful to God, and the city of man, the part of humanity that lived in sin. For St. Augustine, the old Roman Empire was a manifestation of the city of man. It was built on the desire for earthly glory, carried out through the use of violence. Even after the official conversion of the empire to Christianity, the empire remained built on a sinful foundation. The peace it brought about was only made possible with the threat of violence against those who might break the peace. Therefore, the empire could not claim true justice or righteousness. St. Augustine thus called Christians to not despair over the fall of Rome, as all earthly empires are subject to rise and fall, but instead to look to the true city of God in the kingdom of heaven. St. Augustine's monumental work contains many great insights into the relation between Christianity and the world. St. Augustine would live through the decline of Rome, of Roman power in the West. And when he died in 30, the city of Hippo was being besieged by the same barbarian army that sacked Rome 20 years earlier. It must be mentioned that the Goths, Vandals, and other barbarian Greeks had been converted to the Arian form of Christianity towards the end of the 4th century. This conversion was largely the work of the Arian bishop named Ulfilas, who also developed an alphabet for the Gothic language and translated the Bible into Gothic. Arianism thus became a badge of barbarian identity opposed to the Orthodox identity of the Romans. Both St. Jerome and St. Augustine were inspired in different ways by the example of the Desert Fathers. Some Desert Fathers in Egypt, such as St. Pachomius the Great, had already begun to organize communities of monks under the leadership of an abbot. And this kind of monasticism was called a Cenobitic monasticism, as opposed to eremitic monasticism, the hermit life lived by St. Anthony and others. The idea of communal or Cenobitic monasticism then would be further shaped in the East by St. Basil the Great. This tradition was brought to the West by St. Martin of Tours. St. Martin was born in Hungary and served as a Roman soldier before becoming a monk. He settled at Tours in Gaul, where he became a bishop. As both a bishop and abbot of a monastic community, St. Martin led a missionary campaign throughout central Gaul. The model that St. Martin established, the monastic missionary bishop, will be important especially for the spread of Christianity in Britain and Ireland and other parts of the West. The monastic movement St. Martin inspired in Gaul was, however, rather disorganized. All sorts of people attempted to imitate what they heard about the Desert Fathers, often of eccentric or disastrous results. St. John Cassian aimed to establish his monastery in the monastery of St. Victor at Marseille around 415. He aimed to give order to Western monasticism. Born in what is now Romania, St. John Cassian had travelled through Egypt, visiting various ascetics and compiling their teachings. St. John Cassian's books have become foundational texts of monasticism in the West. In fact, they're the only writings of Western, or rather Latin church father to be contained in the Philokalia. In these books, St. John Cassian gives a more balanced explanation of the problems of grace and free will, debated by St. Augustine and Pelagius. St. John Cassian taught that salvation could be worked out through a synergy or cooperation between human free will and divine grace. Whether divine grace is the all-important to salvation, and without divine grace, salvation is impossible, and yet human free will is never cancelled out by it. This more balanced position, of course, is the more traditional Orthodox position. At this same time, the idea of the papacy also was undergoing some significant changes. In the 3rd century, the dispute between Saint Cyprian of Carthage and the Pope of Rome, Sylvester Stephen I, whether it was necessary to baptize people who were received into the church previously be baptized by heretics. To defend the authority of his position, Pope Stephen invoked the text of Thou art Peter as applying to himself uniquely, claiming himself as Bishop of Rome to be the sole heir of St. Peter. This idea would grow, especially being promoted by Pope Damasus, the same Pope who commissioned St. Jerome to translate the Vulgate. In line of his idea of his calling, Pope Damasus strove to work for greater canonical uniformity among the Christians of the West. Among the canons he sought to impose across the West was a canon requiring the celibacy of bishops, priests, and deacons. However, it took several centuries for this rule to be adopted in all parts of the West. This rule, of course, was never accepted in the East, except in the case of bishops, and that was after some centuries. Pope Leo the Great, another later pope, would see himself not simply as an heir of St. Peter, but as the mouthpiece of the apostle in the world. He felt this to be confirmed, especially in the Council of Chalcedon, the 4th Ecumenical Council in 451. Although unable to attend the council, St. Leo sent a letter known as the Tome of Leo, which defended the Orthodox faith at the council, both against the teachings of both Nestorius and the Monophysites. When the letter was read during the council, the assembled bishops exclaimed, "Peter has spoken with the mouth of Leo." Despite the fall of Rome in 410, the Western Roman Empire would continue for a few more decades. It was, however, a mere shadow of its former glory. Its emperors simply puppets of barbarian military leaders. Eventually, in either 476 or 480, the barbarian general Odessa forced the lost emperor to abdicate. Odessa proclaimed himself as king of Italy, with the backing of the Eastern emperor. However, with the backing of the Eastern emperor, another rival named Theodoric the Ostrogoth overthrew Odessa and took the title King of Italy, though accepting the nominal overlordship of the emperor in Constantinople. This map shows the division of the Western Empire into the various barbarian kingdoms. Some Roman Christians adapted themselves to this new political order. One of these was a Christian intellectual and lay theologian named Boethius. Unfortunately, Boethius was accused of tossing with the Eastern Emperor against Theodoric. He was arrested and sentenced to death. While in prison awaiting execution, Boethius wrote his famous Constellation of Philosophy, a book which draws on his wide reading of the ancient classics to find meaning in what he was suffering. The Constellation became one of the classics of Latin literature. In the post-Roman West, learned men like Boethius were essential for the preservation of civilization, law and order. But a few men of this solely educated wealthy class would become bishops. As such, they received a measure of respect from their rulers. At the same time, their learning and influence on society made them essential as people able to preserve order in the post-Roman world. This developed a tradition of bishops serving not only as religious leaders, but also as secular statesmen, serving as advisors to kings and judges in court cases. And this tradition of bishops has uniquely continued today in England to this day. In the year 535, the Eastern Emperor Justinian the Great launched an invasion of Italy, seeking to restore the empire's past greatness. The Eastern Empire maintained its control of Rome and southern Italy for several hundred years. Several popes of Rome during this period were also Greek speakers from the East. The institutions that best weathered the storm of Rome's fall were the monasteries. Monasticism received a fresh formation from St. Benedict of Nursia. St. Benedict founded his famous monastery of Monte Cassino near Rome. Here he developed a rule for monks based on the writings of St. Basil and St. John Cassian. Over the following centuries, the rule of St. Benedict would become the most influential monastic rule in the West. St. Benedict and his monks were especially responsible for developing the Western Divine Office, the routine of daily church services, which is one of the oldest unchanged divine offices practiced today. Monasticism had begun as an escape from the world in order to focus on the inner spiritual life. Further, during this period, following the fall of Rome, monasticism would have a side effect of salvaging and preserving classical civilization. The monasteries preserved islands of order and education in a society in collapse. Literacy was essential for Benedictine monastic life, where monks were expected to be able to read the services and read the Bible for themselves. Monks would therefore often work copying manuscripts and thus preserving books. A similar project was undertaken by a man named Cassiodorus. Cassiodorus was, like Boethius, an educated Roman who found himself working for the new King Theodoric. Cassiodorus even had an ambitious project to civilize the barbarians and establish a school for higher education in Rome, like the schools which existed in the Eastern Empire. However, the invasion of Emperor Justinian prevented these plans from taking place. Cassiodorus retired to his country villa in Calabria, which he turned into a monastery. Cassiodorus wanted a community that was not only knew the scriptures, but could teach and defend them. He also laid plans for growing a community of highly educated men whose service to God included a dedication to learning and preserving classical literature. Cassiodorus' ideal of monastery was both a house of prayer and a house of learning and a treasury of civilization. It was adopted by the Benedictines and repeated by them as a model across the West. It was thanks to these Benedictines that so much was preserved of the Latin classical world, and thanks to them that in the centuries that followed the fall of Rome, civilization could be rebuilt in the West. In 81, Monte Cassino was sacked by the Lombards, and the monks therefore took refuge in Rome. Pope of Rome in this time was St. Gregory the Great, known in the East as St. Gregory the Daggerlist. He is commemorated at the pre-sanctified liturgies in Lent. St. Gregory belonged to a wealthy Roman family, but decided to become a monk and turned his city mansion into a monastery. He was made a priest and later became Bishop of Rome. St. Gregory was particularly impressed with the Benedictine monks and began to establish a community of Benedictines to serve the Basilica churches of Rome. This created a model of Benedictine communities not living in remote monasteries, but serving at the cathedrals of major cities, as what was called the monastic familia, or the monastic family that accompanied the bishops of these cities. The Benedictine divine office therefore became the standard order of daily services in the Western Church. St. Gregory is also influential for the reform and development of church music in the West. The music of the Western Church, of course, is the Gregorian Chant, which takes its name from St. Gregory and from his influence on that. In the West, it would become a tradition to number St. Gregory the Great together with Saints Ambrose, Jerome, and Augustine as the four Latin doctors, an honorific title akin to the three holy hierarchs of the Eastern tradition. These paintings from a church in Norfolk in England show these four doctors together. Despite the development of the idea of the papacy, Papal primacy still did not mean the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Rome over the cardinal territories of other patriarchates. And this reality
The excited pups hugged the girls. Hello, said.
And this reality is clarified in the 6th century in a series of letters written by St. Gregory the Great. St. Gregory was shocked to hear that the Patriarch of Constantinople, that is St. John, who was St. John the Faster at that time, was using the title ecumenical patriarch. The word ecumenical comes from the Greek ekumene, which means inhabited world. And for St. Gregory, this logically meant that the Patriarch of Constantinople was claiming a universal jurisdiction over the whole worldwide church. In actual fact, the title meant no such thing. Constantinople was, being the imperial city, was known as the ecumenical city. Therefore, the chief office holders of state offices in the city tended to use the word ecumenical in their title. For example, the chief librarian of the city was called the ecumenical librarian, which did not mean he claimed any authority over other librarians in other parts of the world. Despite this, it was almost providential that St. Gregory had this misunderstanding, because he sent a stern letter to the Patriarch of Constantinople, affirming that it is utterly unacceptable for any bishop to claim a universal jurisdiction. St. Gregory also sent letters to the other patriarchs about this issue. And the Patriarch of Alexandria wrote back to St. Gregory. And in the letter, he addressed St. Gregory as universal pope. St. Gregory then wrote a letter back to the Patriarch of Alexandria, rejecting any such title for himself, reaffirming that no bishop could claim universal jurisdiction, not even the Pope of Rome. In contrast, St. Gregory coined for himself a much humbler title, the servant of the servants of God. During the same period, barbarian peoples began to embrace the Orthodox faith. All the Roman Gaul had become occupied by a people known as the Franks. And in 508, King Clovis of the Franks was baptized and established orthodoxy among his people. The Frankish kings who followed Clovis were known as the Merovingians. In 596, St. Gregory sent missionaries also to convert the Anglo-Saxons of England. The already Christianized Franks played an important part in the mission to a neighboring country. The Franks emerged as the dominant power of the continental West. In 732, the Frankish general Charles Martel, or Charles the Hammer, halted the advance of the Muslim Arabs into the west, the Battle of Poitiers. Charles was mayor of the palace of the Merovingian kings. However, since the time of Clovis, the Merovingians had declined as effective rulers and become mere figureheads of the country, and the real power of the country was in the hands of the mayors of the palace. At this time, the Eastern emperors were giving support to the iconoclast heresy. And in 731, Pope Gregory III called a council in Rome which condemned iconoclasm. Rome was still within the territory of the Eastern Empire, however. Yet, because of Pope Gregory's condemnation of the emperor's religious policies, he cannot rely on the emperor to defend him from invasion by the Lombards. Pope Gregory therefore turned to Charles Martel, asking him for protection. Yet, despite the appeals of both Pope Gregory and his successor, Pope Zachary, Charles never did come to Rome's aid, being too busy fighting the Arabs. After Charles died, Pope Zachary continued his appeal to Charles' son, Pepin the Short. Pepin, like his father, served as mayor of the king's palace, holding real power over the Franks. Pepin wrote to the Pope asking if, seeing that he held the real power over the Franks, he might legitimately depose the current puppet king and make himself king of the Franks. Pope Zachary agreed to recognize Pepin's assent to the throne as legitimate. This increased both the prestige of Pepin's family, known as the Carolingians after Pepin's father Charles, by allowing them to claim their authority from the Pope, and also increased the papacy's understanding of itself, since now it became accepted that the popes had powers to depose and elect kings. In 754, the new Pope, Stephen II, met Pepin and made him official protector of the papacy. Pepin then led a military campaign to recapture the lands surrounding Rome. After his success, Pepin gave these captured lands to the Pope for himself to rule as his own personal kingdom. This was the beginning of the First Papal State, which continues in a much reduced form as the Vatican City State. Meanwhile, the emperors in Constantinople protested against Pepin's actions, the lands being rightly his. The papacy responded to the emperor's protest of a document called the Donation of Constantine. This document claimed that the original papal state had been created by the donation of Emperor Constantine the Great back in the 4th century, which is an event depicted in this fresco. And for a long time in the West, this document was believed to be authentic, until it was finally discovered to be a forgery in the 15th century. In reality, the Pope's rising dominance was being supported by King Pepin, who looked to the papacy to legitimize his own right to rule. And this alliance between the papacy and the Frankish kingdom would continue under Pepin's son Charles, and in history as Charles the Great or Charlemagne. And at the same time, there was an increasing alienation between the Rome and the Eastern Empire. At the end of the 8th century, Pope Leo III was beset by various enemies, accusing him of various crimes. In the year 800, Charlemagne arrived in Rome to settle the controversies. On the 23rd of December, the king chaired a council that decided that the Pope could not be subject to judgment, being himself the highest authority in the church. Pope Leo, under oath, declared his innocence. Then 2 days later, during the liturgy on Christmas Day in St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Leo placed a crown on Charlemagne's head and proclaimed him Augustus of the Romans, or Emperor of the Romans. At this time in Constantinople, the Empress Irene held the throne, arguing that it was not right for a woman to hold the imperial throne. The Pope therefore acknowledged that the throne of the empire was empty, and therefore he was acting on the precedent set by Pope Zachary, who elected Pepin as king of the Franks. Pope Leo believed he had the right to and the freedom to choose Charlemagne as a new Roman emperor, much to the displeasure of those in the East. Charlemagne's empire became then what would become known as the Holy Roman Empire. Charlemagne's empire was established both in imitation of the emperors and was established in imitation of the emperors in Constantinople. He promoted learning, leading what would become known as the Carolingian Renaissance. He gathered the best scholars from across the West to work and teach at his court. Among them was the English monk Alcuin of York. Among Alcuin's achievements was the systemization of the Roman liturgy. In fact, what Alcuin produced would become the standard liturgy of Rome and eventually the West, and would remain so until the Roman Catholic reforms of the 1960s. At the same time, Charlemagne's empire would be opposed as a rival to the Eastern Empire. This is the Frankish Empire, which is Charlemagne's empire shown in orange on this map. He claimed his empire to be the true heir of the Roman Empire. Eastern Romans, therefore, were now dismissed simply as being Greeks, and later as Byzantines. Well, in fact, they continued to think of themselves as Romans right up to the fall of Constantinople, and even beyond that period. This confirmation of alliance between the papacy and the Franks led Charlemagne to lead a reform of the continental Western Church. Among other things, he included the promotion of the addition to the Nicene Creed of the Filioque clause. The complex theology behind the Filioque had its origins in some of the writings of St. Augustine of Hippo, of which the idea that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son steadily grew in popularity. The Filioque clause was first added to the Creed in the West in 589 at a local council in Toledo in Spain. However, it did not spread widely until the time of Charlemagne. And famously, Pope Leo III of Rome himself disagreed with this innovation and famously had the Creed in both Latin and Greek inscribed in silver plaques, which was then set up in St. Peter's Basilica without the addition of the Filioque. Another church reform led by Charlemagne was to organize the bishops of his empire under archbishops who under his oversight. Many bishops resented this policy and saw it as a curbing of their independence. In response, some put together an elaborate forged document known as the False Decretals of Pseudo Isidore. And this document was a dossier of forged letters and supposedly written by early popes, including some forged or garbled versions of more recent letters and church canons. And the purpose of these texts was to prove the true authority in the church was the papacy alone, which was then delegated to local bishops to serve as the Pope's representatives in various places. Any infringement of the rights of these local bishops by kings or archbishops was therefore an infringement of the rights of the Pope. The false decretals would, however, have a long-term effect of promoting the idea of the papacy as the source of all ecclesiastical jurisdiction, even over the authority of ecumenical councils. And this idea would have become soon to be accepted in Rome itself, as the papacy sought to strengthen its position against both Eastern emperors and Holy Roman emperors, who in time began to try and exert their own control over the papacy. The papacy also would have come to, at the same time, would have come to accept the inclusion of the Filioque in the Creed. And this new idea of the papacy would then characterize future relations between popes and Eastern Church, eventually leading to the Great Schism. This is all I have to say for tonight. So you can stop recording.